Okay, so today I'm going to demonstrate the workings of the knitrdata R package for building standalone Rmarkdown documents that include both the text, the code, and the data that is used in the analyses. So first, before I start, I'm just going to say that I'm using R version 4.02, and I am using Rstudio version 1.3.959. Knitrdata should function with somewhat older versions of either or both of those, but not ancient versions. So the way I'm going to go about this is first I'm going to do a somewhat smaller, simpler example, a somewhat theoretical example, and then I'm going to do an example of a real publication that colleagues and I recently submitted that I'm going to make standalone by including all the relevant data and documents inside one document. So the first thing one needs to do to use the knitrdata package is to get the package. And so to do that, you can go to the GitHub webpage. So it's under user DM Kaplan 2000, repository knitrdata. And there it provides instructions for installing the package either from GitHub or using CRAN. CRAN typically has a somewhat older version of the package than what's available on GitHub. So I'm gonna grab this off of GitHub and install it in R. So we just execute the code. It goes and searches for the package on GitHub, downloads it, and installs it. All work well, it should be installed. And once you have the package installed, you should have two things. You'll have the package itself, which includes both a vignette that explains how it works and documents the various functions in the package. The vignette is fairly comprehensive and explains the workings of the package itself. You will also have in the add-ins part of Rstudio a series of add-ins provided by the package. And I'll explain how those work in a second. Okay, so now that we've got the package installed, we can go ahead and use it to build some standalone Rmarkdown documents. So the first example I am going to demonstrate is a small example where I took a data set off the web, digitized it, and I'm going to analyze it in an Rmarkdown document, a simple Rmarkdown document. So I've created a little template of the Rmarkdown document itself with what we're going to do. So first, the data itself. So that is some data that's on the Washington Post website. That is the number of false or misleading claims that President Trump has made since the beginning of his presidency. So I just took a screen grab of this data, digitized it, and created an Excel spreadsheet with the data. The Excel spreadsheet is very simple. It just has one column with the dates and the second column with the number of lives for the given month. Okay, so what I want to do is create an Rmarkdown document that first loads the data, then does a little linear model fit. I'm going to plot it and plot some diagnostic plots. And it's the loading data part that is going to be used for loading with knitrdata. So first, the first thing you need to do is in any Rmarkdown document that's going to use knitrdata is you need to load the library, typically in the setup chunk. Now you can load it this way, but we can also load it in a little bit more sophisticated way that will avoid errors if the package itself is not installed when you start to load it. So if you go to the package vignette and you go to the installation and getting started section, there's a little bit of code you can copy into your Rmarkdown document. And what this will do is essentially test if the package is present, and if it's not, we'll download it off of GitHub. Okay, so once we've got that in the code, we're ready to start using knitrdata. So we want to load in this Excel file, and we're going to use these add-ins in order to do that. Now, I'm just going to present them real quickly. The one we're mostly going to use is insert fill data chunk, but I'm going to present the other two add-ins real quickly. So insert empty data chunk basically is the conceptual equivalent of going to insert and say inserting an R chunk. It just inserts an empty chunk that is ready for you to be filled out by hand. It has some default options, and it includes some instructions that are meant to be deleted. So it says to fill out one of these output var or output file. So let's just fill out output var. We'll delete the output file. And suppose we wanted to by hand load some CSV data into the Rmarkdown document. So we could, set the loader function to read CSV and have, say, some typical data. And if we put that in the code, in the chunk, and then put in an R chunk that just displayed the df variable that will be created by this data chunk. If we go ahead and knit it now, it's just going to go ahead and create it. So the first block here is just echoing the contents of the data chunk, and then the code df listed. And so it shows that knitrdata used the contents of the chunk to create a data frame df with the actual contents. Okay, so that's the basics of how knitrdata works. You encode data inside inside special chunks, and those chunks are read in based on a set of chunk options, and then you should be able to use the data either as a variable in the Rmarkdown R session, or things can be exported out to files. Now that we've seen how the insert empty data chunk has worked, we can proceed to what we actually wanted to do, which was to include that Excel file with all the data. So before we do that, we want to get rid of these chunks that we put in here. Now I could just highlight these chunks and delete them by hand, but particularly for large chunks, it's convenient that I created a remove chunks add-in, which basically allows you to select the chunks you want to delete and click remove chunks, and they go away. So we're back to our starting point. So now we're ready to insert the actual Excel data. So for that, we click on the Insert Filled Data Chunk option, add-in, and it brings up a dialog. The dialog at the top says what's the active document and what line number we're going to insert the chunk at. There's a Create Chunk button, which we do at the end to insert, and a Cancel button to not insert something. The first option is to select the data file. So I'm just going to select that Excel data file. Then we can put in a chunk label. Now, because this file was a binary file, it went ahead and checked some options that are appropriate for binary data. So it's format binary, encoding base64. Base64 is basically a way of taking binary information and translating it into text so it can be included in a textual Rmarkdown document. There's also the GPG encoding, which is for encryption, and I'll talk about that later on in this example. Do MD5 sum checks. So MD5 sums is basically a hash of the data file. And by including that option, there'll be a check of an MD5 sum check of the output during the knitting process, which will basically ensure the integrity of the data. So yes, we do want to do that. We're going to encode the data. I'm going to say create an output variable called trump. And for the loader function, output file, I'm going to leave empty. We'll show the use of that later. For the loader function, I'm going to use the open XLSX package, which includes a read XLSX function. Yes, we're going to evaluate it, so we'll set evaluate trunk is true. we are going to echo the chunk contents. We are not going to echo the chunk contents because, as you'll see, they're not particularly pretty. We don't want them in our output document. And there is one additional chunk option we want, which is the loader ops, which basically gives additional options to this read XLSX function. And so we want to set the detect dates option equal to true. So that's an option in read XLSX that allows it to detect dates. So once we're done with all that, we're ready to just hit the create chunk button, and it inserts the chunk. So just like before, the data chunk is composed of a header, the standard chunk opener, a lot of unattractive base64 encoded data, and of course the closer of the chunk, the three dashes, the three quotes, backwards quotes. So just to go over this, we have the data moniker at the start of the chunk header. Then we have the chunk label, format binary, encoding base64. We're going to put it out to an output variable called trump. We are not going to echo the contents. This is the MD5 sum of the original data file. It's going to be used to check the data integrity when we do the knitting. And it would fail if by mistake I change the actual contents of the chunk. We're going to evaluate it. We have our loader function and our loader function options. Now, one of the criticisms of knitrdata is that it inserts potentially large amounts of this fairly ugly base64 information into your file. Now, this can seem inconvenient at first, but Rstudio provides lots of ways of basically being able to ignore that that's there. So you can just navigate the document using the standard navigational tools that are included with Rstudio. So I can move around this data chunk without any problems. The other thing you can do is that Rstudio provides a little button here for you to just hide the chunk contents. So if I click on that, the chunk contents are hidden and you can move around your document as if the chunk wasn't there. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that because I don't really need to see all that information. So now that we have the knitrdata part done, we can start inserting our analyses. So I'm just going to do a few analyses just for fun. So we can create a linear model of lies as a function of dates with date equals trump. We can put out a summary of that to see what it looks like. We can also plot the data. Let's just do a plot of lies versus data. And let's do just some formatting stuff. Okay, we can add the regression line to the plot. Okay, maybe, we did a linear model. Maybe we should do some diagnostic plots. So we can just do plot m,1 and plot m,2. Okay, so now we have our standalone Rmarkdown document. It's important to note that at this point I could delete the original Excel file from the directory. It is not necessary to knit this document. This is completely standalone. If I just hit knit, it will go ahead and knit it and generate the document with the analyses. So indeed, the output of the linear model is that there is a significant positive increasing linear effect in the number of lies per unit time or over time. There is the data itself with the regression line. If we look at diagnostic plots, there's some large anomalous positive outliers of months that had a very large number of misstatements, false and misleading statements. And the same, you can see that in the QQ plots that we have at large theoretical quantiles, we have some large standardized residuals for those points. So this is now a completely standalone document. You could send that to a colleague, and they would have everything they need to repeat the analysis. So now that we've finished with a simple example, we're ready to do a more complicated example. So this example is based on a paper that colleagues and I recently submitted. That's an Rmarkdown document that creates the entire paper. It's a fairly sophisticated document that uses a mixture of book down and capabilities in the articles package, with a lot of both code, doing the analyses themselves, and text, and working on figures and all that. So it's a fairly complete Rmarkdown document, but it depends on a fairly long series of external files. So there's the Rmarkdown document itself. There's 3 BibTeX documents. There's a single data.rds data file that includes the data that is analyzed in the paper. There's a CSL formatting file for formatting references. There's a CLS file for defining the journal format. And there's also an external online supplementary Rmarkdown document. So second Rmarkdown document that uses the same data that is meant for the online supplementary. So what we want to do is take all of these files and put them into one file. So I'm going to go ahead and show you how to do that. First, I'm going to save the document as a different file in a different directory, so to have a clean start, and so that you can see that it indeed will work without any supporting files. So now we're in this directory with no other additional files. And so let's go through our steps to make this standalone. First, we want to load the package itself, but the package itself actually is already loaded in the Rmarkdown document, because there is a table that was generated using Rmarkdown in the paper itself. So I used a Rmarkdown chunk to just import a table listing the different models that we evaluated, and then used cable to make a nice table out of that. So we already got knitrdata. So the next thing we need to do is start creating some knitrdata chunks. So in particular, sort of towards the beginning of the file, it loads that RDS document. Okay. So the first thing we want to do is incorporate that into the actual, into the Rmarkdown document. I'm going to do that right at the start after the setup chunk. So we just go to Insert Fill Data Chunk. We will browse for the appropriate file. We're going to say Load Data RDS as the chunk label. It is indeed a binary file, but we're not going to use base64 encoding. We're going to use GPG encryption, and the reason for that is that the data itself is actually confidential, and so we don't want just anyone to have access to the data, though the analyses themselves and how we did the analyses are not confidential, and we do want to share those. So GPG encoding of chunks provides an option to do that. So when you click on GPG, it will just appear a dialog, GPG receivers, and those just list the potential keys that you could use to encrypt it. And so I'm going to suggest 2. I'm going to select 2. One is for myself, and another is the Secofed Research Group, which is my colleagues. Okay. So I can go ahead and choose those 2 receivers. I do want an MD5 sum check, and I am going to encode the data. This time I'm not going to fill out the output variable name. I'm going to fill out the output file. And the reason for that is I'm not going to touch any of the other code in the document. I'm just going to use the data chunks to create the external data files. So by putting in the output file name, it will process the chunk and spit it out to an external file called data.rds that later on in the script will be loaded into the Rmarkdown session. So with output file, the loader function is not necessary, so I'm going to go ahead and delete the suggestion that it placed, which was read RDS, because it recognized that it was an RDS file. For evaluate chunk, it has automatically changed to a test of whether or not the file exists. That can be deleted and replaced with true or false or whatever you want, but that test basically avoids overwriting an existing file. So I'm just going to leave that as it is, and those are all the options we need in this case. So we can hit the Create Chunk button, and it's going to insert this data in. Now the file itself is a 1.4 megabyte file, so it's a fairly large file, and if you go through, you'll see there's quite a large amount of this base64, or actually this GPG encrypted data. Now, as I said previously, you can just click on the little button and scrunch down the chunk. And once you've done that, you can move around and edit your document as you would before. It's a little bit slow while the chunk itself is on the screen, but once the chunk itself is off the screen, it works as normal. Now, Rmarkdown, or Rstudio, excuse me, does not want to open a document that is more than 5 megabytes in size. You can still create standalone Rmarkdown documents. You just won't be able to edit them in Rstudio if they're bigger than that. But this is a file that's below that limit, and so that we can directly include it and edit it in Rstudio. So as I said, once we get beyond that chunk, we get it off the screen, it will, you can edit as you normally would, and everything works as one would normally expect. Okay, so now we've got the data in. Next, we want to add the auxiliary files that are associated with it. So I said there's several BibTeX documents. There's a CLS and a CSL file for formatting, and there's an online supplementary Rmarkdown document. So even though the BibTeX files are referenced at the beginning in the YAML header of the document, so they're referenced here in the YAML header, they're not actually used until after all the chunks have been evaluated. They're used in the final formatting step of creating the output document. So we can actually put them anywhere in our Rmarkdown document, and in particular, I'm going to choose to put them at the very end, because that's the most convenient place. At the very end, there's already some code that would render the online supplementary document if desired. And I'll come back to that online supplementary because it's a little bit more complicated than the other auxiliary files. But first, I'm going to do all the other auxiliary files. So I'm going to put a little comment in here, auxiliary formatting files, and we can start inserting those. So again, we're going to use the Insert Filled Data Chunk option. We can go to Browse, and let's start with the BibTeX files. So I have the bibliography.bib. I will copy that file name and use it as a chunk label. It's text. We don't want it encoded, so we'll get rid of those two options. By default, MD5 sum checks are turned off on text documents because there's a little bit of a difficulty about whether or not the document ends with a new line or not. But you could turn that on if you were certain that the text document ended with a new line. Again, we are going to spit it out to the file, bibliography.bib, and those are all the options we need. So if we just hit Create Chunk, the chunk is in the document, and this time the chunk is just text, so data can be text in the knitrdata context. And what will happen is when this chunk is processed, the chunk contents will just be written out to this bibliography.bib file, which can then be used for formatting the document. So we'll just hide that content because we want to add others. So I'm just going to keep going here. I'll add another one of these bib files. So we can just go ahead and add those. Once once you know what you're doing, it's a fairly quick process. Just inserted another chunk. We can again scrunch it down and insert another. I'll just keep going here. So we have the third BibTeX file. We again use that as the chunk label. It's good to put in informative chunk labels because it allows you to navigate your document, and also if you ever need to delete a large data chunk, it's useful for finding it. So we've got all the BibTeX files, and now what we need to do is just insert the two additional formatting files. So there's the CLS file. And there is the CSL file. So now we have all of our 5 formatting files in the document. Now the final file we would like to include is the online supplementary file. So now in principle we could add that just like we did all the other documents. So we just go to Insert Fill Data Chunk, go to Browse, we select the file. We want to do it obviously before that file would be used, so I'm placing it before the rendering command. And we can do everything as we would do before, except there's one issue that I'll explain in a second. So the issue is that if we put this textual data in a chunk as is, it's a document that includes chunks itself. And so you would have chunks inside chunks, and our Markdown and Rstudio would get all confused, and it wouldn't work. So instead of just including it as plain text, we can base64 encode it. So we can encode text documents if we want to. And I'm also going to choose to do an MD5 sum check. And so once we do that, we can include it as MD5 sum or as base64 encoded text that will be decoded during the knitting process to create the Rmarkdown document. So once we've done that, and you see this is the actual base64 encoding of that online supplementary Rmarkdown document. Again, we can just hide that away, and we have our 5 formatting files, or 6 actually now, that are included in the document in addition to the data chunk at the start. Okay. Now that we have our document with everything inside it, we're ready to knit it. So I'm going to go ahead and just click on the knit button. As it processes, it's going to hit those data chunks, and it's going to export the contents out to files. And so we'll see the files one by one start appearing here in the Files tab of the Rstudio window. It's going to take a while because it does a lot of analyses in the process, and so I'm going to stop the video and then restart it at the end to talk about a few last elements. So I'm going to hit knit, and we'll watch it work. Going through the setup chunk right now, and it's about to hit that data chunk. And so in the process, it created the data.rds file, and now it's going to start doing all of the subsequent analyses. Now the document is finished knitting. It has produced the final output PDF of the paper. And if we look at the directory where the knitting occurred,
we see that it generated all of those files. So it generated the data.rds, but also the bib, the 3 BibTeX files, the CLS files, and the CSL file, as well as the online supplementary.rmd. We want to just open that online supplementary. We see that it did indeed translate the base64 contents into the text that we wanted. So we have created a single document that contains everything we need to reproduce this paper. And we can imagine putting that on an archival website as a reference, or just communicating with colleagues. Now, if at some point we decided, well, we've already got this data.rds file out of there, maybe we just want to, we don't really need it in the document anymore. It's just as simple as going to the Remove Chunks dialog, and we can just click on that large chunk that we want to remove and get rid of it. Once we've done that, now we have a much smaller and lighter Rmarkdown document that we could edit and modify as we see fit.